Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the MCIE for the opportunity to be here with you tonight. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about shortages and disruptions and some of the things that are going on in the world, although many of you could probably write this what's going on in more detail than I'm going to share with you. But I think it's an important thing to look at. We're going to look at a couple of the drivers, some things you might not be aware of, and then I'll give you some thoughts on what kinds of actions you might be able to take. So you want to go to the next slide, please? So these are just some of the disruption types that we typically see. And we're seeing these in different areas across the board. So in some industries, in some areas, we're seeing demand drop. I think people with inflation worries and things like that are not buying some more luxury type things. But at the same time, we're seeing demand surges in a lot of different areas. So there's been a lot of companies scrambling to keep up with demand. We've seen reduced productivity, but on the other hand, we've seen some increased productivity too from companies who report that maybe their work from home workforce has been more productive during the shutdowns. And then others maybe on site have had hits to their productivity level. So we're kind of seeing things across the board. We've seen a lot of access restrictions and storage restrictions. And I think Elizabeth and Tom talked about that a little bit, where we're looking for places to store trucks and trailers and things that when they do come in. And we all know that we've been shut down in China for a while, so they haven't been shipping things out as frequently. And so that's going to have to catch up at some point too. So that's been a restriction. And then as Elizabeth and Tom so eloquently said about this truck shortages, the driver shortages, a lot of those elements as well go into that. And we've all seen a lot of raw material shortages. How that affects you and your business depends on what kind of business you're in. If you're in the electronics business and you're trying to get chips, you've probably been scrambling. And I hate to tell you, but you're going to be scrambling for a while longer. When this first kind of came to light in early 2021, I did a talk on that, and I looked at my notes from that not too long ago. And I said at that point, this was like January, February of 2021. And I said, people are projecting that it's going to go well into 2022. So now they're unfortunately saying it's going to be probably through into 2024 and maybe throughout 2024 that we continue to see these shortages in chips. So, and we see car manufacturers that are shipping cars without all the chips in them. So not all of the bells and whistles work. So there's some different challenges with raw materials. We're seeing baby formula, which is not a raw material, but if you need that, it's pretty important. So that's a shortage too. And we're seeing a lot of different types of shortages, impacts, some temporary, some very looks like longer term. And companies are really assessing their reliance on outsourced manufacturing resources. So they're looking at where are we doing business? And typically up until the pandemic, companies really focused about 80–90% on tier one suppliers. But the pandemic exposed a lot of things that companies weren't aware of. And so now they're really not looking only at the tier one suppliers, but they're digging in to say what's happening with our tier two and tier three and on down, not only because we need to look at things like greenhouse gas emissions and conflict minerals, but because we need to know where they are and what our risk is associated with that. I remember at the beginning of 2020, I was talking to some people when they first announced the shutdown, and they said, oh yes, we're not really worried because we don't buy anything we don't buy anything from China, is what they told me. And I talked to them a couple months later actually, and they said, wow, we have a few electronic things, but we had no idea how many things come from China and how that might affect us. And that's just continued to show itself and be more transparent throughout the pandemic. So can you go to the next slide, Vincent? Thank you. So we know the pandemic continues, and thankfully we are having some back to in-person events, and we're doing more travel. We're doing a lot of different things, but we know that there are still warnings and reports of the pandemic surging in areas. Recently in the Bay Area, I have colleagues in that area, and they said they had gone back to a work from home environment for a couple of weeks until they thought that surge passed. Luckily, we're seeing with so many people being vaccinated, I think is a contributor, but we're seeing less severe consequences from the virus if you do get it, but a lot of people are still getting very, very sick, and there are still a number of deaths on a daily basis. So with all these different disruptions, there was a study that was done by the organization that says that 72% of CEOs are worried about losing their job this year, due primarily to disruptions, due to the activities that are going on, the problems that they're having. This was 3,000 executives, and it was done by Alex Partners. And so they've said their main challenges are material shortages and the rising costs of transportation and material. And 33% and 31% of the respondents said those were their two top issues. And then after that, it fell to 18%, and their worry there is about their ability to respond to unexpected events. I think this has made everybody more aware of the fact that there are so many risks lurking in supply chains, and when they come up, they surprise people and companies, and they're not able to respond as quickly as they would like. And the other issue they have, both of these are at 18%, were the non-availability of transportation capacity. So when they can't get what they need, when they need the capacity and transportation to move it from place to place. So there's a lot of activity around this. And these same CEOs and executives, again, 3,000 executives, the 77% feel that their actions to address these disruptions just are not going to be enough. So they're running out of suggestions on what to do. They're running out of options. They've tried different things, some working a little bit, some not working so well. So we're going to see that more and more. And as the economy sends warning bells about inflation and possible recessions, and we still see different global supply chain issues, like again, the stoppage in the Shanghai area, especially for shipments due to the COVID shutdowns, the way that the Chinese government is handling that. And we've seen different governments across the globe handle it in different ways, but those impact the workers, impact the ability of companies to produce the goods. So disruptions are the number one concern of 69% of these CEOs. And yet that's not their only issue. Again, as Elizabeth and Tom talked about, there's a lot of hiring concerns. This great resignation kind of thing is quite a challenge for companies. And I was at an event, it was also a manufacturing alliance for the San Joaquin Valley. I was at that event last week, and one of the other speakers talked about the fact that if every person looking for a job today found one, there would still be 5 million jobs unfilled. So people are looking carefully at jobs. They're being very deliberate. They're taking this opportunity to try to get better positions for them, and better work circumstances, better benefits. So if companies want you, then companies are bending sideways to try to get people on board that will fit their needs and also fit their company environment. We also still have a lot of concerns about IT network management. So, Elizabeth stated some things at the beginning of this, that there are some IT connectivity issues. Some people are blaming Zoom. Some people are blaming the internet. And we all know that IT continues to be a challenge. And when people are struggling and challenged, then that's when we see more hackers and we see a lot more things with IT challenges in that area. And as I said before, COVID is not done with us yet. So next slide, please. So there are a lot of reasons that we have so many disruptions that we're seeing all across the globe today. Part of it is a lack of preparedness. And I said before, a lot of companies were very surprised by the extent of their risk exposure and the weaknesses in their supply chain that they just really didn't think about that much before the pandemic hit and started exposing a lot of things. And then so they weren't prepared for this. I can speak for myself. And if you had told me in 2019 that we were going to have a pandemic in 2020, I would say, well, maybe in a third world country, but surely not here in the United States. And yet that's what we've been dealing with. So the preparedness is one piece of it. Another one is the flexibility. We've been told time and time to get processes, get standardization, do things, make things routine and best practices and those things like that. So what we found is we had some of those in place all across the board, and yet those processes weren't as flexible as they needed to be for a lot of companies. Many companies had to pivot. That word is a lot more popular than it was 2 years ago. Companies have had to pivot and change what they do, change what they make, change their capacity, their capabilities, a lot of things on the fly, trying to just stay alive during the last couple of years. So this has been exacerbated when companies have single and sole sources. So single sources may be a fine thing because the traditional definition of a single source is you just put all your business with that one supplier, but there should be low switching costs and there should be lots of suppliers that you can use in case this one doesn't work out for you. And what we found is that when that one supplier had a lot of issues, the competition that was supposed to be readily available wasn't necessarily so. And we've seen all kinds of issues like the freeze that was in the Texas and the southern part of the United States last spring. And companies are still dealing with reverberations from that, from the chemical availability. We're seeing chemicals change processes a little bit due to some regulations. And then anytime you have these in your finished goods, you may have to do things like requalifications and go through a lot of quality checks over and over again. We've seen a lot of resources diverted to things like vaccine manufacturing, PPE, a lot of healthcare kinds of products that weren't readily available 2 years ago that we needed. So we're seeing people pivot, and we're seeing mundane products not as available as they were. And then anytime you have a sole source, you should know that that is a risk, because that means by definition that it's going to be very hard to replace. But we saw a lot of companies have financial issues and needed help. So small businesses needed help from their bigger business customers to get through the pandemic. The added challenge from tariffs and things like that have been a real challenge. And we all know the price of gasoline is just having an effect across the board. So we've seen things, companies have had centralized procurement. Sometimes that's been good. Sometimes that's been a challenge. The single channel distribution, which in some instances was a great strategy, may not have been the best to be as flexible and to pivot throughout the last couple of years. And again, the visibility in the supply chain, I think, was limited because companies just did not recognize the need to get down to tier 2, 3, 4 suppliers in a lot of instances. So a lot of factors contributing to where we are. Next slide, please. So what we've seen is the things we've been talking about. We've seen product shipments delayed. I had a colleague who told me that they had a friend who was actually moving, I think, from the Idaho area to Arizona, and they got everything packed up. They got things ready to go. The moving company came, loaded everything up, but then they had the trailer there with all their goods in it, and there was no driver. So it took them 2 weeks to get a driver that could drive from Idaho to Arizona and actually transport their goods. So in the meantime, they didn't have much choice. They left and went to Arizona. So this is a personal thing, but you can see that this translates to personal as well as business issues. Mm-hmm. So the shipment delays have been an issue, as we've talked about. A lot of quality issues. Companies with this great resignation, they've seen people leave. They've had to hire new people that aren't as trained. The quality issues have cropped up. People had very limited inventories because we had a school of thought that was very lean to keep as little inventory as you could. Maybe they overdid it a bit. And so when they got new inventory, there might have been quality issues. When companies are striving and struggling to catch up with these demand surges, sometimes things get bypassed and we have quality issues. A lot of companies lost revenue, again, tried to pivot to support that. And then a lot of companies have been reluctant to spend and to invest, even though they had plans to make capital investments or improvements or process improvements, to hire, to train and expand their skill set. So a lot of companies have dialed back on that and said, you know what, we're gonna keep this money in the bank for now. We're gonna wait on that, push that out a little bit. Even 6 months can have a big effect on the companies that were expecting that revenue. We've seen a lot of tarnished brands and bad reviews from companies who had practices people didn't like, companies who felt the impact of the last couple of years more strongly than others. So that reputation gets bad. And now we add into that things like the Ukrainian invasion. So companies that are continuing to do business in Russia are getting some bad reviews, and there's some boycotts on those kinds of things, as well as all the political turmoil and chaos that we have here in the United States and the fallout from that. And so we're seeing customers complain more, be less loyal because they found they couldn't count on companies anyway. They couldn't count on their suppliers or the brand that they had used. So now they have changed and they're not as loyal. They're flipping suppliers more quickly. And so that's adding a lot of havoc to the supply chains. Next slide, please. So when we look at these disruptions, there's a couple things we want to look at. We really want to look at the probability that something is going to occur. So after the disruption has already happened, we can say, okay, what's the extent of the impact? But when we're trying to be a little proactive and looking at, okay, maybe it happened once, what's the probability of it happening again or in another sector of my business? So, and then I'm not seeing this, but I know that these things are happening in other companies in my industry, in other companies in my area. So you're looking now for more risk, which is a good thing. We have a lot more proaction within companies trying to identify the risk and get ahead of it. So we're looking for the probability of something happening, and then we're looking at the other end and saying, if it does happen, how bad is the impact going to be? How strongly is that impact going to be and affect us? So companies are looking at that and trying to make those assessments as they deal with risk management. Next slide. So we're trying to measure the impacts. So again, that we understand the extent of the impact and we can figure out how to avoid it or how to mitigate it, how to lessen it, and definitely not let it repeat and repeat and repeat. So we're seeing all of these things: lost sales, higher freight costs, market share dilution, all kinds of different things that are going on. And companies are struggling to measure this and say, okay, how do we deal with this? And what does this tell us about going forward? Next slide. So 3 things that I think are important for companies to remember. The first is to try to restore some sense of order. And again, assurance of supply is always job one, right? I need parts to keep going. So make sure that you have your parts coming in, do what you need to do for that. Make sure that you're communicating and collaborating with both your customers and your suppliers. And it's important for companies to try to stabilize their cash flow. That's one of the important things to do. And then I think we need to be open to different ideas. So rethink the businesses that you're in and look for other opportunities and other areas to play in. So that means evaluating both capabilities and capacities, looking at efficiencies, productivity, being able to pivot, looking at flexibility and resiliency. And finally, I think that's going to require some redesign. Companies are looking at redesigning their operating models. In that same study I mentioned earlier, 80% of the executives said that they're going to have to change their operating models significantly in the next couple of years. So they're looking at what we need to do to survive. Companies are looking at next generation capabilities, and yet they're still looking for those key customer and supplier relationships that are crucial to them going forward, and making sure that they keep those intact so that they know what to do. Next slide. So Purple Link, what can help you with this? I have a line where you can do a callwithjane.com, where you can set up a free call with me to talk about supply chain issues and anything that you can do. I put my email in the chat if you'd like to get in contact with me and discuss this in more detail, or look at how Purple Link might be able to help your business. And finally, I want to leave you with a slide that I think is important. My strive to thrive for the day is that learning and innovation go hand in hand. And the arrogance of success is to think that what you did yesterday is going to be sufficient for tomorrow. This was a statement from William Pollard, who sounds like he's pretty contemporary, but actually he was born in 1911, died in 1989, and was working on the Manhattan Project and several other kind of groundbreaking things during his career. He's also an Episcopal priest. So he's a good example of someone who managed to blend the spiritual and the scientific, and he's written a couple of books by that. Again, he's deceased, but I thought that this was an interesting statement from somebody who really was not anywhere near where we are today, but I think that this still applies kind of across the board. That's all I have.